And we're going to get started with Jennifer McCoy. And I've been following her work for quite a while. She's an expert on polarization. And, with everything going on in the United States, that's of so much interest to so many of us who are concerned about democracy in Canada, her work is really relevant to us. So Jennifer is a professor of political science at Georgia State University, a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dr. McCoy has authored or edited 6 books and dozens of articles, including Polarizing Polities, a global threat to democracy, and Polarization and Democracy. I don't know if I'm saying this right, a Janus-based relationship with pernicious consequences. Jennifer's research program on polarized politics aims to identify causes, consequences for democracy, and solutions to polarization around the world, including in the United States. She coined the term pernicious polarization to refer to political polarization that divides societies into mutually distrustful us versus them camps and undermines the capacity of democracies to address critical policy problems. So I'm really thrilled that Jennifer is taking time to join Favorable Canada today, and I'll turn it over to her.
All right, thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to see so many people here interested in this problem. And I guess that means that there must be a concern in Canada about this problem. I do live in the United States, though I'm currently in Europe, getting a little bit of distance from what's happening in the United States. So as Anita said, that what I'm most concerned about is what I call pernicious polarization, which is a division of society into 2 mutually distrustful political camps that harms democracy. So we're really talking about, my co-author and I are talking about the pernicious consequences of democracy, of this sort of extreme polarization, where we're looking at the nation as a whole and how it can be divided into these 2 mutually distrustful and antagonistic camps. So what causes this? How do we get to a situation like this in a democracy? What we find by looking at a number of polarized democracies around the world is that it is most often driven by political strategies that consciously aim to divide. So these are politicians, candidates, or elected officials, and their allies, sometimes in the media or other sectors, who consciously aim to divide the electorate. They aim to attract supporters by providing simple answers to complex problems, usually by blaming some group or their political opponents for the problems. They appeal to emotions like anger and resentment. They paint the other side as an existential threat that must be vanquished rather than a normal adversary who may win this time around or may serve as a constructive opponent. So the consequences for democracy are that when people begin to engage in this and the electorate becomes involved, it negates the possibilities of later bipartisan compromise or consensus, because the voters are now viewing compromise as selling out their own principles and interest. And the opponents have been demonized as even traitorous to the nation. And so they don't want to compromise with them. People stop communicating with others. They develop suspicions and stereotypes of the out-group, that is the other party or the other political camp. And eventually, people become willing to support anti-democratic behavior of their preferred candidates or parties if necessary to keep the other side out of power. So why does it seem to be rising now around the world? In fact, we have seen it basically rising for about the last 20 years globally in most parts of the world. When we look at it and at its enabling conditions, we can see a number of large sort of systemic reasons for it. Simply the intensification of globalization with the end of the Cold War. There was a political convergence around market-oriented democracies, market-oriented policies in the 1990s that really dampened the distinctions between political parties as mainstream center-left and center-right converged on basic economic issues, and they began to loosen their ties to social groups like labor unions and church groups and others. Global problems of migration, terrorism, climate change, pandemics, growing inequality, all of these things raised insecurities of citizens. I would also point to changes in information technology. People always ask, isn't social media the cause of this? I say, no, it isn't actually. I would go back to the 1990s, the rise of cable news, talk radio, the establishment of the internet and people's use of it that proliferated sources of information. Then finally, after about 2010, enters social media, which also made it easier for politicians to reach voters directly. Another reason for, or enabling condition for this rise in pernicious polarization is actually the result of the success of democratization in many countries, as democracy itself provided subordinated groups with the tools to demand greater inclusion and inequality. This in turn often produced a backlash from those who had been the dominant groups and now saw their status being threatened or were afraid that subordinated groups coming up toward equality might be taking away from them rather than just adding to the whole. In some countries, we see deep historical roots, something that we call formative rifts. And these are basically debates, unresolved conflicts and debates that go back to a country's founding. So this may be over in the United States. I'll give you an example. This would be over racial equality, over gender equality. It might be over the role of religion in a society, but it basically has to do with who is considered a rightful citizen and what is the national identity, the national story. And finally, I want to mention institutional factors, because the institutional setup, the constitutional arrangement, the electoral system can exacerbate polarization. And here, I think we can especially point to the electoral system and the fairness of representation. We have found in work looking at countries around the world and comparative studies that the countries that have highly disproportionate systems of representation, which usually come from single-member districts, sometimes even proportional representation countries, or mixed systems can have it. But these systems, when they're highly disproportionate, exacerbate the winner-take-all sense of politics and make people feel like it's really a zero-sum game, a win-lose game. It creates distortions in electoral results, sometimes even false majorities, and this can contribute to this sense of anxiety, this sense of insecurity, and these perceptions of threat that we see with growing polarization. So when voters don't feel represented, particularly in the single-member district systems, such as United States, Canada, and Great Britain, which are the three major Western democracies that have this, most other democracies, I will point out, do not use this system. India, another extremely large democracy, does. But in this system, when you have a single winner in the district and those who didn't vote for that winner, they may not feel represented, particularly when partisan antipathy is already high. And the consequence may be that these voters become so alienated that they either drop out of politics altogether, they just withdraw, or they may become receptive to a demagogic leader who promises to tear it all down. And this is often what we see in perniciously polarized democracies. Now, in the United States, of course, everyone has been following it with our election very recently, but we have a two-party system, two-party dominant system that's facilitated or enabled by our electoral system. We also see high negative partisanship, people voting against a candidate rather than for their preferred candidate or party. Along with that, we've seen, of course, the rise of very negative, vitriolic campaigning. We also saw, I diagnosed part of our election results 2 weeks ago, at least partially as the result of our rigid binary system, where voters who simply wanted change from the status quo, from the current party in power, really felt they had no other choice than to vote for the single other viable alternative, even if they found that choice undesirable or even reprehensible in some ways. If they wanted change, that was the only choice. Today, in fact, the United States is alone among wealthy Western democracies in its level of pernicious polarization. It is much more similar to other less wealthy, younger democracies, but also large democracies, multiracial democracies. So countries like India, Turkey, Brazil, and also it's alone, the United States is alone with its associated democratic backsliding when compared to the other Western democracies. So I hope that Canada does not follow us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I really appreciate that. I think what stood out for me is just when you said that sometimes the political strategies in the system aim to make it worse. They aim to divide and conquer, like you said. And that's of great concern to us, how we can stop that from happening or discourage our politicians from doing that. So I'm going to move on to Camille Bernhardt, who is from Belgium. Camille is a researcher at the Free University in Brussels and at the University of Warwick in the UK. His research shows that democracies that use proportional representation have lower levels of polarization. And he won the Frank Cass Prize for the best article in 2023. His new research focuses on how polarization affects the degree of political violence. He finds consensus institutions are able to weaken the relationship between polarization and violence. So basically lowering the chance that polarization leads to violence. So again, it's sort of like what Jennifer was saying, where it can be a positive mitigating factor. And I'm going to turn it over to Camille now to share his findings and his research with us.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen first. But I hope it works for all of you. Great. Yeah, so thank you very much, first of all, for having me. It's an honor to be speaking in an event in Canada. I'm from Belgium. Canada is a very big country compared to our little Belgian country, so it's very nice to also be able to share our findings beyond the small country that we are. I'm going to talk a little about the article that we published last year together with Didier Calouart and Benjamin Bankart on institutional design and polarization. And then I'll also talk about research that's currently under review, which also links with political violence. So yeah, the main idea is that consensus institutions or institutions that are less majoritarian in nature, that those are better in both dealing with polarization and also in dealing with the most dangerous consequences of polarization, being political violence. So yeah, I don't think I should go over this. I think it's clear enough today. It was already clear a couple of years ago, but now it's even more clear that we are living in a sort of age of polarization. Dr. McCoy also talked about it. There are many examples. There have been COVID protests back in Brussels 2021, but I'm sure it also happened in Canada and in the US. There have been the Yellow Vest movements in France, of course, the Capitol riot in Washington. And there's now also the whole polarization around the Israel-Palestine conflict, which only gets worse. There is the Ukraine conflict. I mean, everything nowadays seems to be polarized. And if we look at the statistics, it indeed confirms what Dr. McCoy just said. It's mostly the last 20 years that have seen a very significant and considerable increase in both identity-based and idea-based forms of polarization. I'll briefly tell you about the difference in a bit, but I just want to point your attention towards this part of the figure, which is of course Western and North America, Western Europe, sorry, and North America, where you see that the increase is as steep as in other parts of the world, but that it's still lower than in, for example, Eastern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the Middle East. That being said, we also come from a very low degree of polarization in the 80s, 90s. So the increase is even more profound if you take that into account. Very briefly on the difference between the two, it's important because I think there are different kinds of polarization. It's also a bit linked to what Dr. McCoy has written on pernicious polarization. But I think, for example, idea-based polarization being a form of increasing distance based on idea-based conflict, a conflict based on different conceptions of reality, of different visions on society, on politics, and so on, is less problematic than identity-based polarization, which links more with pernicious polarization, which is a form of widening distance and polarization between different actors, can be two or more than two camps, depending on the conflict, where it's more about identity-based conflict, conflict based on how groups make sense of themselves, construct others, can be national identities, can also be subnational identities, everything that has to do with how people feel that they belong to a certain group is more the case in that second part or second type of polarization. And that's also the one that interests me most, because we know from literature and from the findings that this one is the one that is responsible for the worst effects on democratic integrity and democratic health. So I'm not going to go over this in detail because, again, Dr. McCoy already did, but there are many causes for this steep rising polarization in the last 20 years. But what I'm focusing on, and these are just a couple, of course there are more, but what I'm focusing on, or what we're focusing on in our paper, is of course the institutional design. That's not to say that it's a cause. We're not implying any causality, it's correlational research, but it's still something that has to be taken into account when looking at polarization today. Why? Because we hypothesize and we also find that the chance that conflict erupts in polarization, and conflict is something else. Conflict is really the opposing claims that are being conflicted about, or that are in conflict or in relation with each other, while polarization is really this increasing distance between two or more camps in society. The chance that conflict leads to polarization is to a big extent dependent on the institutional design of that country or of that society, because the institutions or the institution of design is of course responsible for the managing of societal conflict and of power sharing. And when that's done in an inclusive manner, the chance that conflict leads to polarization is lower. And that's the main argument basically that we have in our paper. And of course also linking to the fact that there are different types of democracy is the result from these different institutional designs that exist. And in that, we draw heavily on the work of the Dutch scholar Arend Leijpaert, who has distinguished between what he calls consensus democracies on the one hand and majoritarian democracies on the other hand. Consensus democracies, they really try to include all societal groups as much as possible. Belgium is a typical example of that, but also Switzerland, the Netherlands to a great extent. While majoritarian democracies, there it's really all about the importance of the majority, even slim majorities, winner takes all systems, first past the post, all those kind of ideas where democracy is decided upon the majority and not necessarily the inclusion of as many groups as possible. And that's related to lots of different institutions, specific institutions. For example, the difference between oversized coalitions on the one hand, which we have in Belgium, and minimal winning coalitions in majoritarian systems. It's multi-party versus two-party. It's proportional electoral systems versus majoritarian electoral systems. And it's also sometimes related to federalism versus unitarism and bicameralism versus unicameralism. It's of course very, it's a whole list of institutions, but they all have some importance. And it's also important when, for example, you talk about proportional electoral representation, you also take into account the other institutions of a society, which can also have an impact on the degree of polarization. So the first paper that we did was on just looking at the different types of democracy and then linking that with the levels of polarization. We looked at 36 OECD countries over 20 years, approximately, until 2019, using the data from VDEM, the Varieties of Democracy data set. And there you can see that some countries on the left-hand side are indeed significantly less polarized than the countries on the right-hand side. And just for your reference, if you would be looking if you would have been looking for it, Canada and the US are here in the graph, while Belgium, for example, is more to the left-hand side, and Scandinavian countries, which are typically more consensus-based, are indeed also much less polarized than the US and other majoritarian countries. And we of course, not only looked at it descriptively, as you can see here, we also did some analysis. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the methodology and the analytical strategy that we used, but basically the results are, or the main findings are that indeed institutions striving for consensus are related with less polarization. More specifically, federalism had a very significant negative effect, meaning that federal institutions or federal countries tend to be less polarized. The US is, of course, a very interesting exception to that rule. Electoral proportionality, again, very important, seems to be related with less polarization, and multi-party coalition government. So that's basically the gist of the paper on institutional design. For the second one, we also looked at, sorry if I'm going too fast, but I want to be able that, I'm going to make sure that David also has enough time to speak. And if there's any questions, let me know. But just in the second paper, we looked at polarization and political violence, which is, of course, taking the argument a step further, because here we're not only looking at how polarization or how different types of democracy are related to polarization. No, we also looked at in which kind of democracies the chances are bigger that polarization leads to political violence. And this is just a graph of I think, 116 countries or democratic countries over the last 100 years, in which you can see that polarization is linked to political violence. We know that from the literature. But what we did is going beyond that. We looked at the chance that polarization leads to political violence, or at least is related to political violence. We checked whether that's the same in all kinds of democracy, hypothesizing again that in consensus-based systems, this chance would be lower. And indeed, I'm again not going over all the details statistically, but what we did find is that inclusive institutions, again, more specifically judicial review, multi-party system, bicameralism, and proportionality, all those four institutions lowered the chance that violence occurred in that country, or more specifically, that the link between polarization and that there was a link, between polarization and violence, meaning that in countries such as these, Belgium again is a good example. There is, even if there is lots of polarization, the chance that this polarization is linked with political violence is significantly lower. So these are two main ideas I'm working with at this point. Of course, it's correlational data. I should stress this. It's not causal. We didn't prove that one thing leads to another. We just proved that they're related to each other. But of course, future research is needed on finding how exactly the mechanisms are working, and what exactly is happening behind the models that we ran. But nevertheless, I think it's very relevant and very interesting to see that indeed the type of democracy can have a significant effect on, or can be significantly related, I should say, to polarization and political violence. So thank you very much. If you're interested, you can find the paper open access also on the website of the journal Democratization. Thank you.
Thank you, Camille. That was really informative, and there's so much that we could pick out of there. But the importance, especially of inclusive political institutions, to help counter some of the negative effects that we're seeing around the world. That there's sort of like a protection or a harm reduction strategy, I guess I would say, in the face of a lot of forces that are outside of our control. One thing I really like that both of the panelists were talking about is how this has been on the rise for the last 2 decades. Because I think a lot of people just look at it like it just started with COVID, it started with Trump, it started with Twitter, it's whatever, right? But this is really sort of just, it's been an accelerating pattern, and it has many, many causes beyond social media. So now I want to move over to David Moscrop. David. So David is a PhD in political science from the University of British Columbia and the author of Too Dumb for Democracy: Why We Make Bad Political Decisions and How We Can Make Better Ones. And I understand he might have another book coming down the pike at some point. He provides political commentary and analysis for radio, television, and print. He's a contributing columnist with the Washington Post and the host of the current affairs podcast Open to Debate and Left Looking In. So I'm looking forward to hearing what David has to say from a Canadian perspective.
Thanks. It's always nice to be here. It's good to be back. I'm going to provide a bird's eye view assessment of some of the problems and some things that I think might help. These are largely hypotheses. This is my sense of what the foundational problems we face are, and there's a bunch of them, and they're related. And so I'm going to go through them really quickly and then talk about some potential solutions. And the first problem we face is we're in a low trust environment. As much as we're in a polarized environment, we're also in a low trust environment. And those things no doubt correlate. But if you look at some trust indices, where Proof Strategies has one, Edelman has one, the Economist Democracy Index talks about this a bit too, you find that trust in media is low, trust in politicians is low, trust in government is low, which makes it really, really hard to have conversations, and it really diminishes political capital capacity to do things. And so the first issue is we've got a trust problem. As noted throughout, I'm not going to stay on this because we've established it. We have a polarization problem as well. In Canada, it's not quite as pronounced as in the United States, but it exists here. Often Canada is let off the hook because we compare ourselves to the United States and we say, well, sure, things are really bad over there. They're not so bad here in comparison. But when you take a step back and look at Canada compared to, say, the rest of the world or to our own history, we realize that, oh, you know what? We are facing problems here that are actually quite significant. And if we keep comparing ourselves to the United States and saying, well, the problem isn't that bad, someday we're going to wake up and we're going to realize, you know what? It is quite as bad as that because we've let that happen by letting ourselves off the hook. So we're polarized here too along sort of toxic identitarian lines. We also have a fractured media environment. And I think this is a point that is often not studied or addressed enough, which is with the rise of social media and the decline of the traditional media model, we had a sort of pluralization of the media space. That opened up a lot of opportunity for new voices. It ended a lot of gatekeeping by major corporate and other players, which is great. But at the same time, it led to the rise, sometimes overstated, of filter bubbles and echo chambers, but also radicalization, of balkanization, of this pushing apart because you could find your niche. You could boost messages that you found favorable, ignore ones that you didn't. And the media, as it became less trusted on top of that, didn't have the kind of unifying force, which made it really, really easy to go out into the world and select your own sets of facts. And if we can't agree on the basic set of facts or a basic set of vision of reality, it makes it really, really hard to have political discussions, to evaluate political policies, and to make political decisions, because essentially we're just not even speaking the same language. And in a pluralized media space that's also in a low trust and polarized environment, I think it makes it really, really hard to have those conversations. And as Jennifer mentioned, social media didn't cause polarization; it pre-existed it. And I think her point about cable news is so important. And there's a couple of great books out there about this. 24/7. There's a book called that talks about this in the U.S. And that's just such a critical point that the move to cable news, especially to a sort of adversarial model of news reporting, uh, really did drive this phenomenon. Social media has exacerbated that significantly. And it's also given rise to networked extremism, particularly on the far right. It feeds the agendas of faux populists, of sort of toxic populists of the Trump variety. It makes it really, really easy to rile people up with nonsense and to connect people into groups who believe these things and have those beliefs reinforced by those around them who sort of say, yeah, you're right. Don't worry about what the woke liberals are telling you. We're going to tell you the truth. Ignore all that, and you never really have to contend with anything that challenges that view if you don't want to. In extreme cases, it networks quite literal extremists, right? Like straight up Nazis. You go on to 4chan, you go on to Reddit, even YouTube, and you can find that very, very quickly you would descend into very dangerous, dark places where people will float and recognize and reiterate some of the darkest points that you could imagine, where previously you actually had to really try hard to find this stuff. Now you can find it with a few clicks. Uh, on top of that, in Canada, we have a softening of the immigration consensus, the pro-immigration consensus that's been led by a number of things. In some senses, bad immigration policy, including the temporary foreign worker program, but also politicians who are very keen to throw immigrants under the bus when things get tough. Now we're facing a potential Trump administration that's going to advance mass deportations, aided by, among other agencies and organizations, the United States Armed Forces. That's going to create potentially a migrant crisis in Canada. That's going to potentially develop an anti-immigrant backlash, which is going to fuel a lot of problems too. And so, on top of that, if that weren't bad enough, we're also facing the danger of retrenchment from conservative governments, for the most part, though not exclusively, and potentially one federally. And if we have retrenchment, we're going to see the further cuts to the social welfare state, which is going to undermine economic well-being, which is going to feed, I think, further into trust issues, lower well-being. There's an important material element here, which is going to make life harder and nastier for people, which is going to have no good consequence. Two final last things of note. On top of all of this, we have the climate crisis, which is a disaster multiplier. When this really picks up, imagine refugee crises, imagine scarcities, imagine extreme weather events, imagine not being able to afford insurance, and so on and so forth. That's going to make it hard to govern people. And then the risk of political violence is very real in Canada. Again, we shouldn't dismiss that. It is utterly real. We had the convoy. We have shouts of treason, shouts to hang politician. We had someone drive a truck into the gates of the Prime Minister's current residence at Rideau Cottage. We've had the Prime Minister wear a bulletproof vest at a campaign event in 2021, I believe it was, because there was a very real security threat. So we have a very real danger of political violence, which, of course, once that starts, potentially creates a negative cycle, which is going to further exacerbate the problems that we've discussed. So on the solutions front, there's no silver bullet. It's very, very difficult to tackle these things. I'm just going to advance very quickly a few ideas that I think might help. One is a deep concern for class and economic issues, and for building a stronger, more democratic economy and welfare state where people feel like they're taken care of and they have a sense of belonging, they have a connection to one another, and they can get through the day. I think it's good for trust. It's good for building capacity in the state, and it's good for the fundamental needs, or helping people meet their fundamental needs day to day. So I think there's a class element here that we often, and an economic element we often forget, and I think we should come back to that time after time and remind people that a strong welfare state is a key part of trust building, taking care of people, and building democratic capacity, especially since if you want to take part in political life, but you can't meet basic material needs, your democratic rights are functionally limited, if not erased, right? You have a right to vote, you have a right to protest, you have a right to take part in in forums and so on and so forth. But if you don't have childcare, if you don't have elder care, if you have to work 3 shifts, those rights are effectively denied you in functional terms, right? So in a state in which people make enough money and have the social welfare needs met, they can take part in civic life. PR is not a panacea either, but it's something I've supported for a very long time for the reasons that Anita has mentioned here, and my co-panelists have mentioned. So I'm just going to very quickly echo. I think PR is part of that solution too, and related to that, strengthening democratic institutions through participatory programs. Again, it's not going to solve all our problems. Not everyone's going to be able to take part. But as a deliberative Democrat, I strongly believe things like participatory budgeting and citizens' assemblies, both locally, subnationally, and nationally, are critical parts of bringing people into democratic self-government and in creating a space where you can actually have disagreements and discussions that aren't polarized and aren't potentially violent or abusive, because you created an institution that incentivizes a different kind of behavior. And so I think those are very, very important parts of lowering the temperature and producing better outcomes. We could lower the voting age. I don't want to get into that one too deeply because I know it's sometimes controversial and complicated, but we should be considering bringing in people earlier into democratic self-government. I know in Canada there's a movement to reduce the voting age to 16. I think that's something we should at least be having a discussion about. We should be adopting better social media habits, quite frankly. This is just part of our environment now, alongside media literacy. But we should be thinking about how we use social media and how we potentially inadvertently play into the hands of bad actors who want to make things worse. So think about how you use these spaces and how you might be lured into being a part of the problem. I've adopted a strategy. I've migrated away from Twitter because I think that's part of the problem now. I've moved to Blue Sky. When I see someone trolling or spouting hate, I mute, I block, I move on. I don't boost their toxic nonsense. I don't give them the attention they deserve. I don't let them set the agenda. I just pretend they don't exist and I move on. At some point, I'm thinking about how you engage online, and of course offline is very important because you have some personal responsibility in what you put out into the world and how you manage what you come across when you're out in it yourself. The 3 final things, I'll close very quickly. I think bolstering social movements is more important than ever, especially in light of the Trump administration coming in. Being a part of organizing, being a part of protest, being a part of charitable giving in activity and volunteering is going to be important. When you think, what could I possibly do in the face of all this? The answer is often join some group or organization, especially locally, and do the work where you are, because you can be a part of improving things. You can't do everything, but you can do a little something. And if everybody does a little something in good faith, it scales up pretty quickly and produce a lot of good. And it also creates bonds of solidarity and ties that I think we're going to need now more than we have in a very, very long time. So bolstering social movements is critical. Try to convince elites to climb down from norm busting and toxic identitarian polarization and faux populism. Don't reward them. Call it out. Be critical of it, and consider parking your vote or voting for someone else who doesn't indulge in that kind of politics. And the final thing is fight in the long run. Fight for time, fight for resources, fight for space to engage in political life. Don't simply think of liberal democracy as a panacea system, or as set it and forget it, as if rights can't be taken away or limited, or as if democracy itself can't fall. Because it has and it can. Fight for your place in self-government. Don't simply be a passive object of government. Be a subject who takes part in self-government to the extent that you can. And I think if we, develop a strategy around these concerns and others mentioned, we have a fighting chance at turning things around. But we got to do it, and we've got to do it now.
Thank you, David. You've covered an incredible amount of ground in a very short time, and we'll have time to get into more of the things that we've heard in the questions. I mean, I think the thing that stood out for me is when you said stop comparing ourselves to the United States and patting ourselves on the back, because we're not immune to the kind of problems that we see south of the border, and that it's just never been more important for us to proactively work on these kind of things, because if we don't, they're not going to get better on their own. So I have had quite a few questions here, and so I'm going to start with just one related to terminology and definitions. So Jennifer had mentioned democratic backsliding, and maybe if each of you wants to address this, that's fine if you have something else to add, but somebody was asking, what does that mean? And I guess I would add, what are the signs of it when you see it happening? Because we're in such a partisan, polarized environment that sometimes every single thing the other party does, people will say, oh, we're democratic backsliding because they're doing that bad thing. And so I'd really like to say, look at like, what are the actual signs that democracy is backsliding?
Yeah, thanks. That's what we mean by that is basically the quality of democracy is declining, but it is doing that because it is being undermined from within the democracy. It's not some external actor coming from outside. It's not, a foreign intervention, a foreign invasion. It's not a military coup, but it's within an elected government. And sometimes it's helped by the opponents to that government, but it is generally undermining from within. And it's, signs of it are many, but there is something called an authoritarian playbook that has been identified by a number of scholars that look at what do democratic backsliding leaders do? What are the steps they take? And there are certain things that we see in common all around the world. And we're kind of on the alert for that in the United States right now. These will include basically trying to, the leader or the executive, whether it's prime minister or president, will try to undermine the separation of powers, override other branches of government, erase accountability mechanisms. They often will try to harass and silence critics in the media. They will intimidate. And it's interesting. The first step, what they do is they'll intimidate, whether it's journalists or political opponents or dissidents or, civil society protesters. They will simply threaten, maybe with tax investigations or with threatened judicial investigations, lawsuits, and that causes self-censorship. So people begin to pull back in advance before they're actually, hurt or damaged. There is also closing of civic space, so putting constraints on civic organizations, nonprofits' ability to finance themselves or how they can operate. So these are some of the steps. There are others, but these are some of the main things they do. And then actually I have to mention the last one, which is they often try to change the electoral rules to the advantage of their own party to help entrench themselves in power for a longer time.
Thank you, Jennifer. That last one was quite relevant to us sometimes. David or Camille, do you have anything to add to that? Okay, all right. So the second question I got, I'm going to kind of combine two questions here. So one of the things I saw come up in the chat, and I've seen it come up in other situations too. Sometimes when we talk about polarization and some of the bad things that are happening and these really alarming signs, sometimes they seem to be all coming from the right. And then when we point that out, people will say, well, now you're blaming the right, so you're increasing polarization because you're blaming the right. And what about the other guys? So I'd like to I'm wondering if the three of you could address that. How do you answer that? Because obviously I don't think it's entirely the fault of one party, and simplifying it down to that is obviously not going to help us solve it. Whoever wants to go first, just jump in.
Okay, I'll go, though I don't want to always be the one speaking first, but it's really important to note that we see polarization is often does involve both camps. And so there's an action by one side and a reaction by the other. If the opponent, so if one side starts polarizing, and when I'm talking about polarization, I'm really talking about this pernicious kind, this demonizing, discrediting of the opponent, So it's a little bit different than some of the other types that Camille was talking about, ideological or idea distancing of parties. So I'm focusing on this. Using this kind of pernicious strategy that's intentionally divisive, vilifying the opponent. If the opponent responds in a like way, insulting, discrediting that leader and insulting the supporters, then that can start a spiral going downwards. And that can begin to lock in both sides into this pernicious logic of polarization, the trap of polarization that I call it, that gets hard to get out of. So it is often both sides that are causing it, but we can also see that it can be very asymmetric. And so one side, one leader may be really pursuing it, another may be trying to rise above the fray, you know, take the higher ground, and then they realize, oh, they're being, you know, skunked every time. And so then they think, well, maybe we've got to enter in, we've got to get dirty and, you know, enter in as well. And it's a problem, but then we have to start talking about the solutions to that.
David.
Yeah, we're seeing this in Canada right now. The fact is that the Conservative Party and Pierre Poilievre have an agenda that is fundamentally built on attacking the government in increasingly vicious ways, accusing them of being extremists, Marxists, accusing them of having traitors in the government who are part of, you know, foreign interference efforts and so on and so forth. Pierre Poilievre refuses to get his security clearance because he doesn't want to be hampered by that knowledge that he gets from having that security clearance. He wants to go on the offensive all the time. And the liberals are starting to take the bait and respond in kind by attacking him. And so we're seeing, I think, the development of that pernicious polarization here in Canada right now in real time. And I think the problem that Jennifer raises is so important. And I don't think we have an immediate solution here in Canada, which is the Conservatives have adopted that strategy because it works. And people are taking them up on it, especially in the context of anti-incumbent backlashes in electoral democracies right now around the world, which is caused by probably a bunch of things, but the certainly core among them is inflation. As you know, the German economist Isabella Weber says, you know, inflation is the government killer, and people are picking up on that. So it's a really nasty environment. But if you don't respond to a bully by punching them in the nose, you're going to get more bullying. And so it's tricky because at some point you say, well, the voters have got to demand better. But what if they don't? And so I don't see an immediate response to this because I think the Conservatives are set to win and their political strategy is going to work. I do think, though, it's going to rebound on them. And 4 or 5 years from now, they're going to face the same things themselves. But so I actually look to the future and ask myself, in 4 or 5 years, when the Conservatives are on the back heel, which they very well may be, we're going to have an opportunity to say, we're going to do politics a little bit better, a little more productive, a little more responsible. And I think the key going forward will be to pressure parties, our own side now, to behave ourselves better when we have the opportunity to choose between a more productive and less productive road. And just to close out on this point is, because I do think it's prevalent on more than one side, you've got to at some point say to your own side, we expect better from you too. When you can. But I'm not entirely convinced we're going to be able to do that. I'm actually very worried that we're going to see the double pernicious polarization because people come to think that that's the only way you can win.
Camille, do you have any comments or thoughts?
Well, it's an interesting question, of course. Whether it's something that's coming from one side. I joined the other panelists in saying that, first of all, I don't know of any research that actually proves that. I think it's always coming from both sides, or more than both sides, because in Europe we often have polarization coming from multiple fronts, because we have multi-party systems, of course. So I don't think it's something that we can blame on one side. Nevertheless, there is, of course, a difference in how certain parties I'm speaking from the Belgian context now, conceptualize democracy. And when you are more on the extreme right side, for example, Flemish Interest or Vlaams Belang in Belgium is having a very particular conceptualization of democracy and also thinks it's okay to enfranchise or even delegitimize the other side or dehumanize the other side. If you start with that kind of discourse, then of course the polarization that occurs or that erupts from that is worse than more idea-based forms of polarization, and you're much faster or much quicker into a pernicious kind of polarization than you are when you're just talking about ideological differences. But that's not to say that other sides can do that as well. I think we should be very careful about blaming that on one particular ideology or one particular side. It's more about how people think of democracy and how we as democracies in general should be vigilant in protecting our core values.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment too. These terms have come up a lot, and I know that Camille and Jennifer touched on it as well, the difference between idea-based polarization and identity-based polarization. And it took me a little while to kind of figure out how really very important that is. And I'll just give you a little example here. So last night or the night before, I watched, I'm a geek, I watched the Irish leaders debate. Ireland's having an election right now, and there were not 2, but 10 party leaders on stage for 2 hours answering questions. And what I saw there, because they are a country that uses proportional representation, was a lot of idea-based differences along traditional lines. You know, differences in how active the state should be in solving problems. Those kind of differences were very evident and passionate. What I didn't see was anybody demonizing anybody else, calling anybody else names, saying the entire problems of the country were blamed on, you know, name said individual who was obviously corrupt just because they were in government, and all the kinds of things that I see on a daily basis here. It was a very different kind of polarization. And so polarization is not necessarily bad when it leads to a vigorous and engaged debate about a common set of facts. But when we're not dealing with a common set of facts and we're demonizing people, that's the thing that I think we're all really, really worried about. Okay, so the next question is, and we have about 15 minutes, and I know I'm sort of repeating ground, but because, for instance, some of you covered so many things in such a short time, let's sort of dig into this a little bit. When polarization starts to get entrenched, how can we as citizens help to reverse that? So, I mean, I heard David saying, you know, well, maybe like in 5 years, maybe we'll be, I'm trying to put words in your mouth, David, but maybe in 5 years, we'll be a little more motivated to get together and try to do that, right? But then there's always the uncertainty that what if we're not? So if you could, again, put out what's your best ideas that people could do right now to help turn down the temperature and get us on a better track. Go ahead, David.
Really quickly, I'll reiterate 2 points. One is think about how it is you engage in the world, because I see a lot of people go online, and this happens offline as well, but it's particularly prominent online, say the other side are a bunch of X, Y, Z, and I hope they burn in hell. And then when the other side says it, they say, "Oh my Lord, they're being so polarizing and mean." And if you hold the other side to a higher standard than you hold yourself, then you're going to have a bad time, because 1, you're contributing to the problem. 2, it's going to be very, very hard to persuade someone else to behave better, because they're going to look at you and say, "Why would I do that?" You can't even do that yourself. I'm not going to play by a different set of rules. So part of it is just modeling the behavior that you want to see in the world. And this is going to sound so hokey, and I apologize in advance, but I honest to God cannot think of a better way of being in the world than the golden rule of behaving towards others the way you'd want people to behave towards you. I tried to, and it's so hokey and it sounds so obvious, but when you're in the heat of the moment and you remind yourself of that, you say, "Oh, right, maybe I could be a small part of the solution by being better and by counseling other people to be better." And as a corollary to that, don't boost the toxic nonsense. Block it, mute it, don't engage, and move on. And then again, that's online. offline, go be a part of a civic movement that you think is contributing to a better world, and use your time building capacity and political trust and social cohesion and what's the Putnam line? Capital out in the world, because it's very, very easy to get caught up in the heat of the moment when you could actually just be out in the world doing better in real life, face to face with other human beings.
A really good point, David. I think that is where we are able to fight back most effectively, when we build actual real relationships with other people rather than spending time arguing on some anonymous online forum. Jennifer or Camille?
Yeah, I want to add, David earlier gave us a really good list of a lot of things that can be done. And at the citizen level, in addition to the great things he just suggested now, I want to add that there's a lot of research that talks about the psychology, the social psychology of this whole problem, which is really of in-group, out-group conflict. And there are a couple of things in there, but one thing we know is that people want to be heard. They want to be respected. You don't necessarily have to agree, and you don't have to persuade somebody to join, to agree with you on your opinion, and they don't have to agree with, get you to agree with them. They just want to be heard and, given some dignity and their opinions dignified. And I have found that curiosity is the best way to deal with learning about why someone else thinks so differently. I saw some questions, about in the Q&A about what in the world were Americans doing, voting for Trump. Why are people voting for Trump? Well, one thing I've tried to do is be curious and ask people and try to get underneath. What is it, what brings you to your political position, to your political beliefs? What life experiences might bring you to this your position on this issue? And once you get down to that level, you find that you probably do share some basic values. You understand your shared humanity, and that begins to allow us to once again begin to problem solve together. And I always try to really urge citizens and voters, like David was talking about, resist those politicians, reject those politicians who engage in this. Do not reward them. Do not vote for them. And especially do not pass on the disinformation and engage in the clickbait and the sharing of false articles on social media and passing on those kinds of rumors. But I want to give one positive example of a country, because we kind of left the last question very negative. How do we get out of this when we have pernicious polarization, two parties who have been reduced to the gutter? What's the alternative, or how do you fight a bully, as David said? And that example is Brazil. Recently, Brazil had a figure, they called him the Trump of South America, but Jair Bolsonaro was a polarizing candidate and really demonized the other side and was beginning to threaten some Democratic backsliding. And so in the last election, when he was running for re-election, the opposing candidate from the left, a prior leader of Canada named Lula da Silva, was a leftist, but he was able to build a broad societal coalition around democracy. And that is, he got even some conservative politicians, but he got corporations, centrist politicians, people who didn't agree with his policies, who didn't necessarily agree with, all the things that he tried to do in his previous administration. But they were concerned enough about democracy that they came together in this broad coalition to defeat Bolsonaro. And so that's where I say that it can't just rely on the political parties. It really is a whole, it takes social movements, it takes pressure from below, grassroots movements from citizens to demand the change that you want and to reject the political violence and the political demonization. And then it takes higher level, kind of the influencers, whether they're from the corporate world, the podcast world, the Joe Rogans of the world, all of this, the artists, the sports figures, who are going to come together around the ideals of democracy and everything else that we're trying to promote, and to denounce political violence. And finally, it takes courage in the political parties to denounce violence by their own members, their own supporters. And when we don't have that courage, and this is a lot of what we're seeing in the United States, a lack of courage and people more concerned about their political careers and losing their political careers than they are concerned about the broader good.
Camille, do you have some thoughts, suggestions for folks?
Well, I couldn't agree more, so I'm not sure whether I can contribute more. I think most of the important things have been said. So yeah, maybe move on to the next question then.
Okay, yes. I just want to reiterate, I really liked what Jennifer and David had to say, and particularly a practical example of a country that has depolarized is really inspirational, because it lets us all know that it's possible and that civil society can play a role in it. So, you know, going back to what David was saying about getting involved with civic organizations, sometimes the organizations that are focused around democracy and process issues, like Fair Vote Canada, are not the most exciting organizations to get involved in when you feel threatened on issue X, Y, Z, your partisan tribe, and all this kind of stuff. So I would encourage everybody to show up, be there in these organizations, help strengthen them, because that coalition for democracy is going to become even more and more important as the years go by. So I had one more question, since we have about 8 or 9 minutes left. It's a little on a different track, but folks are wanting to know if there is a connection between electoral systems, polarization, and inequality. And I think they're talking about economic inequality. I know that's a big, huge question, but if there's a way that you can address whether there is a connection, that would be great.
Neil, I don't know if have you studied that relationship in any of your work? Because
Well,
I can comment, but I think you may have looked at it.
yeah, we tried in a previous paper, which of course is still under construction, or under it's work in progress. But it's very interesting. It's a very, very interesting question, because the data, and there's also now a paper being published by a colleague of mine from the Netherlands. There seems to be, at least it's very important that we are talking about the right definitions here, but at the individual level. So when we're looking at how people are polarized at the individual level, the degree of economic inequality or economic positionality doesn't seem to play that much of a role. And that's something that we didn't expect. It's also something that we find in our research. Very important, if you look at objective indicators. So if we, for example, compare people from the lower strata of the economic ladder with people from higher strata, then they are equally polarized. However, when we ask people about the degree to which they think that they are left behind, or that they are worse off than their neighbors or than whoever else in society, those people are more polarized. So it doesn't seem to be about real inequality or real objective measures of economic hardship. It's more about the idea behind it. The relative deprivation literature there is very interesting, because it's more about, if you have the feeling, even if you aren't, objectively speaking, but if you have the feeling that you are worse off than somebody else in society, then the chances are bigger that you will be more polarized, which is, of course, a very interesting and somewhat counterintuitive finding, because we, of course, thought that poorer people, or people that are more subjective to inequality, are also more polarized. But at least in the Netherlands and in Belgium, that's the two countries in which we did the study, which are in relative terms quite rich and countries with the highest social welfare systems. There we didn't find that relationship in objective terms. But again, I should stress, we're talking about individual level polarization here. It's something else than the pernicious polarization that Dr. McCoy is studying.
Thank you, Camille. I think what I heard from you, and I think we're we are all seeing this a lot, is that perception matters a lot more than fact sometimes. If there's politicians that are feeding a perception because it helps their political fortunes, then we're increasing polarization, even if the relationship with inequality isn't direct. Did you have something you want to say on that too, David? I saw you nodding your head.
Just very quickly, that some of the trust indices find that there's a spread in trust between higher and lower earners, right? And I always go back to material conditions, both the perception of and the reality that at a certain point, if you're not careful, people are genuinely going to see themselves as outside of the system and not want to give it buy-in because they feel like they're getting screwed by it. And the fact is, a lot of people are getting screwed by it. Like there are a lot of people who are struggling, who are worse off. Wealth inequality in Canada is growing right now, and it's been growing for some time, and that creates a lot of problems. And people feel helpless, and they feel like they're shut out of the system. Then they don't buy into it, they don't trust, and they become more susceptible to demagogues and to populists who will come along and pick them up and draw them in like the Pied Piper. So the material element is again itself not a panacea because there's lots of people who are well off who feel otherwise, as Camille notes, but it's certainly a way to start and to help. And certainly on trust, that's an issue. So it's something that that we have to pay close attention to. But it's very hard to forget to do that when a lot of politicians want to ratchet up the culture wars, because that's a very effective strategy while diminishing a lot of or ignoring a lot of class issues.
I totally agree, David, and I think it sort of goes back to what Jennifer started with is, and there's a big feeling in the last 20 years, a feeling people have of insecurity, regardless of how insecure they actually are. That's like open season for people that want to exploit that. So I really appreciate the time that each of you has taken to help us understand this issue better, help us understand how it's connected to our political institutions, and to encourage people to get involved locally, get involved nationally, help make things better, and that we can turn this around, but it's going to take everybody coming together in a lot of concerted effort. So thank you all again. And if anybody has found this webinar somehow and is not on the Fair Vote Canada mailing list, I would encourage you to go to our website, sign the Declaration of Voters' Rights, and help us join the campaign. Help join the campaign to make every vote count and have a more inclusive and fair democracy. So thank you all. Goodbye.